If you want to understand where the American empire stands today, you don't need ancient history. You only need to look at the last 12 months. Because the clearest signal of imperial transition is not collapse. It's compression. As 2026 begins, the United States is not failing. Markets still operate. Institutions still function. The military remains unmatched. The dollar still anchors the global system. And yet everything feels tighter. Decisions feel heavier. Mistakes feel more expensive. Every solution seems to create a new problem somewhere else. That feeling isn't psychological. It's structural. For 40 years, the system expanded faster than its contradictions. Growth absorbed debt. Power absorbed mistakes. Confidence absorbed inefficiency. Pressure could be exported, delayed, or diluted. Over the past year, that mechanism stopped working. Economic policy is constrained by debt and inflation at the same time. Political authority is weakened by polarization, while being asked to manage greater complexity. Global leadership is still expected, but coordination is slower and more contested. What's new isn't any single problem. It's that they're all happening at once. Empires don't enter their late phase when something breaks. They enter it when everything still works, but nothing feels flexible anymore. When every decision carries trade-offs that didn't exist before. When the system stops feeling like a tool and starts feeling like a weight. History has seen this moment before. Over the last 500 years, dominant empires followed the same arc. Different cultures, different technologies, but the same structural timeline, roughly 2 to 3 centuries from emergence to rebalance. Not collapse. Rebalance. Britain followed it. Spain followed it. The Dutch followed it. Before them, Rome did too. Each believed its system was permanent. Each learned that structure outlasts belief. The United States began its imperial cycle in 1776. That date matters not symbolically, but structurally. Because once you track what happens next phase by phase, pressure by pressure, the present moment stops feeling random. The question isn't whether the American empire is ending. History rarely works that cleanly. The real question is whether it understands where it stands on the timeline now that the old model no longer works. The new one hasn't formed, and pressure is shaping every decision. That is where the American empire stands at the beginning of 2026. The early American empire didn't rise because it was wealthy, advanced, or orderly. It rose because it was hungry. And hunger changes how societies move. Hungry systems take risks, comfortable ones never would. Between 1776 and 1820, the United States was not a polished power or a coherent machine. It was a restless organism, expanding in every direction at once, driven less by ideology and more by raw necessity. The population was young, not just in age, but in mindset. Most people had little to protect and everything to gain. Failure wasn't a tragedy. It was a signal to move again. Land was cheap, often violently so, stretching westward faster than any central authority could meaningfully control. Social mobility wasn't a promise. It was a requirement. If a town collapsed, you left. If a system broke, you improvised. There was no safety net to preserve, no stable equilibrium to defend. Only motion. This mattered more than political philosophy. The federal government was small because it had no choice. It lacked the reach, the capital, and the administrative capacity to manage complexity at scale. What looked like weakness on paper became strength in practice. Decisions happened quickly. Rules stayed loose. Local solutions filled gaps that centralized power couldn't yet touch. Trust didn't come from institutions. It came from proximity. You knew who you traded with. You knew who enforced norms. And when systems failed, they failed locally contained, survivable, and instructive. Energy, in every sense, was cheap. Physical energy came from land, wood, rivers, and labor. Economic energy came from opportunity itself. There were no entrenched elites strong enough to block movement at scale. No dense bureaucracies slowing adaptation. Capital flowed informally, often personally. Mistakes were absorbed quickly because the system was light enough to bend. When something broke, it didn't pull the entire structure down with it. This is the hidden mechanism behind early imperial rise. Low complexity amplifies momentum. When institutions are thin, growth compounds faster because friction is minimal. Every success feeds the next. Every failure teaches without paralyzing. Expansion becomes self-reinforcing. The system doesn't need to be efficient. It just needs to keep moving. But even here, beneath the energy and improvisation, the future is already forming. Expansion creates habits. Movement creates expectations. Success teaches people that growth is normal and limits are temporary. The very conditions that allow explosive rise quietly set the baseline for what follows. As territory expands, coordination becomes harder. As population grows, trust must eventually be replaced with rules. As opportunity spreads, institutions must thicken to manage it. In this phase, none of that feels dangerous. It feels alive. It feels inevitable. The empire isn't thinking about balance or longevity. It's thinking about survival, momentum, and reach. And history shows that this is exactly when empires feel most innocent before complexity arrives, before power needs maintenance, and before the machinery built to manage growth begins, slowly and invisibly, to change the direction of the system itself. Between 1820 and 1914, the American system stopped improvising and started compounding. What had once been motion driven by survival hardened into structure. Expansion no longer happened by instinct alone. It followed rails, contracts, factories, and balance sheets. Territory stretched from coast to coast. Industry replaced subsistence. Distance was compressed into time. The country didn't just grow larger, it grew denser. This transformation didn't feel revolutionary while it was happening. It felt logical. Each step justified the next. New land demanded railroads. Railroads demanded steel. Steel demanded capital. Capital demanded markets. Markets demanded trust. And once trust formed, scale unlocked itself. What used to be local risk became national opportunity. The system began to interlock, layer by layer, until growth no longer depended on any single frontier. It fed on itself. Capital flowed more freely than ever before. Debt increased, but it didn't feel dangerous because growth consistently outpaced it. Borrowing wasn't seen as fragility. It was seen as acceleration. Leverage promised more output, more cities, more connectivity. As long as expansion continued, the math appeared stable. And for decades, it was momentum absorbed mistakes. Scale diluted failures. The system learned to move forward even when parts of it broke. This is the phase where empires feel unstoppable, not because they are invincible, but because feedback loops remain positive. Success produces confidence. Confidence attracts capital. Capital builds infrastructure. Infrastructure increases output. Output reinforces confidence. The loop tightens and speeds up. Doubt gets crowded out. Caution begins to look like hesitation. Restraint feels like weakness. The system rewards those who move faster than it can regulate. The hidden mechanism beneath this phase is scale-driven confidence. When growth works repeatedly, It creates the illusion that growth itself is the solution to every problem. Complexity increases, but it stays hidden behind productivity gains. Coordination becomes harder, but profits distract from friction. Institutions thicken, but no one resists as long as results keep improving. The machine grows heavier and more interconnected, yet it still moves forward. So the weight goes unnoticed. By the later stages of this period, America no longer thought like a young nation. It thought like a system. Outcomes mattered more than process. Expansion became assumed rather than questioned. Risk became abstract. Failures didn't disappear, but they were absorbed by size. When something broke, something else compensated. That resilience reinforced a dangerous belief that the system could handle anything. This is the quiet line empires cross without realizing it. They move from adaptive to optimized, from flexible to efficient, from light to powerful. And power, once accumulated, demands maintenance. Railroads must be protected. Markets must be stabilized. Confidence must be defended. Structures that once enabled growth begin requiring constant energy just to remain upright. In the moment, none of this feels ominous. It feels like progress. It feels earned. It feels inevitable. But history shows this is the exact phase where expansion plants the limits of the future. Because the larger the system becomes, the harder it is to change direction. And when confidence fully replaces caution, the empire stops asking whether growth has limits and starts assuming that limits no longer apply. Between 1914 and 1945, the American empire didn't climb to the top step by step. It was forced there. Global crisis acts like a furnace. It melts old systems, destroys competitors, and hardens whoever survives with the least damage. World War I cracked Europe's foundations. World War II shattered what remained. What followed wasn't a gradual shift in power. It was a clearing of the field. While Europe burned, the American industrial system accelerated. Factories that once fueled domestic growth were converted into engines of global war. Production scaled at a speed no peacetime economy could ever reach. Supply chains stretched, synchronized, and multiplied. By the time the fighting ended in 1945, the United States wasn't merely intact. It was overbuilt. Its industrial base stood unmatched. Its military operated globally. Its currency was trusted not because it was flawless, but because every alternative lay in ruins. This is how empires reach their peak. Not through perfection, but through relative survival. Power concentrates when competing systems fail simultaneously. Europe emerged exhausted, indebted, and physically destroyed. The United States emerged liquid, organized, and structurally dominant. Trust didn't drift west by ideology. It moved by necessity. The world leaned toward the only system still standing upright. This is the moment when the dollar became the world's anchor. Not by announcement, by function. Trade required a stable reference point. Reconstruction required capital. Security required coordination. American institutions stepped into that vacuum and quietly took on global roles. Tools designed for national use now carried international weight. The empire expanded without feeling like expansion because demand was coming from outside. The hidden mechanism here is substitution under stress. When an old system collapses, something must replace it immediately, even if the replacement is imperfect. In moments of crisis, speed matters more than design. Trust flows toward whatever works now. Temporary solutions harden into permanent structures because there is no time to build alternatives. The world didn't choose American dominance because it was ideal. It chose it because delay was impossible. At the peak, everything feels justified. Costs disappear behind victory. Power feels earned, moral, even stabilizing. The empire doesn't see itself as an empire. It sees itself as the backbone of order. This is the most deceptive moment in the entire cycle. Because peak power doesn't feel heavy. It feels weightless. Responsibility is framed as leadership. Control is framed as coordination. Expansion is framed as service. But peaks are fragile, not because they are weak, but because they lock in assumptions. Systems built during emergency are optimized for crisis, not balance. Institutions designed to manage chaos rarely shrink when calm returns. The machinery stays active, even when the conditions that required it have passed. This is why the peak never announces decline. It announces permanence. It feels like the end of history, and that illusion is what makes the next phase unavoidable. Because once an empire reaches the point where its currency anchors the system, its institutions structure the world, and its power feels synonymous with stability, it stops asking how much weight it can carry. And history, patient as it always is, waits for that question to answer itself. After 1945, the American empire didn't slow down. It widened. What had been built to survive a global war was repurposed to manage the world that emerged from it. The machinery stayed on. The scale stayed large. But the purpose quietly shifted. Military presence expanded outward, not as conquest, but as insurance. Bases appeared across continents, justified by stability, deterrence, and order. Each commitment made sense on its own. Together, they formed a permanent global posture no previous empire had ever attempted to maintain. At the same time, finance slipped its geographic limits. The dollar system that anchored post-war recovery evolved into a global operating layer. Trade, credit, and capital increasingly flowed through American markets, American institutions, American rules. This wasn't framed as dominance. It was framed as responsibility. When crises appeared elsewhere, liquidity moved. When markets froze, stabilization followed. When governments struggled, frameworks were offered. The empire didn't seize territory. It underwrote complexity. For decades, the system held. Productivity remained strong. Demographics were favorable. Growth absorbed cost. Each new responsibility was added during periods of success, not stress. Momentum carried the weight. Like a machine rolling downhill, speed made mass feel irrelevant. Weakness existed, but it stayed hidden behind motion. This is how overexpansion really happens. Not through arrogance, but through obligation. Once a system becomes central, stepping back becomes dangerous. Every retreat risks instability. Every withdrawal threatens confidence. So commitments persist. Structures remain. The machinery grows heavier even as the original conditions that justified its size begin to fade. Debt changes character during this phase. It doesn't appear reckless. It appears practical. Borrowing smooths friction. It allows the system to do more without confronting trade-offs directly. Costs rise, but they're deferred. The bill doesn't vanish. It's rolled forward, masked as growth. Over time, debt stops functioning as a tool and becomes a requirement. The system no longer asks whether expansion is affordable. It asks whether contraction is survivable. The hidden mechanism here is load accumulation. Every responsibility adds weight. Every institution adds inertia. Individually, none of it looks threatening. Collectively, adaptability erodes. Decision-making slows. Feedback weakens. Problems are patched instead of resolved, because resolution would require dismantling structures that now support too much of the system. Trust begins to thin, quietly, not because institutions collapse, but because they grow distant. Processes become layered. Outcomes feel abstract. The system still works, but it no longer feels close. Innovation gives way to maintenance. Experimentation gives way to preservation. The empire shifts from building the future to defending the present. At this stage, enemies aren't the primary threat. Weight is. Like a massive structure engineered to withstand storms, the empire spends more energy holding itself upright than moving forward. Overexpansion doesn't announce collapse. It announces strain. And strain doesn't break systems suddenly. It accumulates slowly, invisibly, until even minor shocks reveal just how heavy the structure has become. By the early 2000s, the American system was no longer expanding in any meaningful external sense. It was still moving, still producing numbers, still generating headlines, but the motion had turned inward. The machinery built over decades of growth continued to run, yet it no longer created the same lift. Output persisted. Markets functioned. GDP looked acceptable. But the energy that once pulled the entire structure forward had fractured. Wealth accumulated, but it stopped spreading. Productivity no longer lifted the system evenly, it pooled for a growing share of the population. Progress slowed or stalled altogether. Wages lagged behind costs. Opportunity narrowed. The future felt less open than the past. This wasn't a sudden break. It was a quiet divergence between statistics and lived reality. And that divergence mattered more than any single economic indicator ever could. Institutions responded the way large systems often do under pressure, not by transforming, but by insulating themselves. Structures designed to solve problems became structures designed to manage risk, especially internal risk. Rules thickened. Procedures multiplied. Accountability diffused. When stress appeared, it was deferred, diluted, or redirected. The system still functioned, but it no longer felt responsive. It felt defended. Debt changed roles again during this phase. It stopped behaving like a bridge to future productivity and began acting as a substitute for it. Instead of financing new engines of growth, borrowing sustained existing structures. Asset inflation filled the space where real expansion had slowed. Prices rose not because underlying value accelerated, but because liquidity had nowhere else to go. On paper, prosperity remained intact. On the ground, it felt increasingly abstract and unreachable. This is the hidden mechanism of stagnation. Preservation overtakes creation. When systems become too complex to reconfigure easily, they default to stability over experimentation. Risk shifts away from institutions and toward individuals. Mistakes are absorbed collectively. Gains concentrate narrowly. The system becomes highly skilled at surviving shocks, but increasingly poor at renewing itself. Politics hardens under these conditions. Not because people suddenly become irrational, but because shared belief erodes. When outcomes diverge for long enough, consensus becomes impossible. Every decision starts to feel zero-sum. Institutions that once unified now polarize, not through intent, but through inertia. Different groups sense the same strain, yet diagnose it differently. Tension escalates because something real is failing beneath the arguments. What makes this phase especially dangerous is that collapse still feels unthinkable. Infrastructure remains intact, the currency holds. The military stands. The system looks strong. But beneath the invisible glue that holds complex structures together begins to crack. People feel it in subtle ways: less trust in fairness, less patience with complexity, less confidence that tomorrow will improve on today. Stagnation is not failure, it is drift, a slow misalignment between structure and purpose. And history shows that once belief begins to erode, systems don't recover through reassurance alone. They either adapt deliberately or they continue forward on momentum until the accumulated weight they carry finally demands a reckoning. After 2020, the system didn't collapse. It compressed. What changed wasn't volume, but pressure. The shift wasn't loud enough to feel like chaos, and not sudden enough to feel like revolution. It felt like tightening, everywhere at once. The kind of pressure that doesn't break structures immediately, but tests every joint, every assumption, every weak point at the same time. Debt continued to rise, but each additional unit delivered less lift than before. What once fueled expansion now functioned as maintenance. Returns diminished while dependence deepened. This wasn't excess, it was necessity. The system had grown too large and too interconnected to slow down without consequences. Momentum stopped being a choice and became an obligation. Institutional trust declined not because institutions vanished, but because they felt remote. Processes grew thicker while outcomes felt thinner. Decisions were justified technically, yet disconnected emotionally. People didn't experience failure. They experienced misalignment. And misalignment is dangerous precisely because it's hard to name but easy to feel. Confidence no longer came from belief in progress. It came from fear of disruption. Demographics quietly added weight to an already stressed structure. Aging populations shift the balance between growth and preservation. Fewer producers support more dependence. Systems built for expansion are forced to manage endurance. Risk tolerance narrows. Flexibility declines. Innovation slows not because ideas disappear, but because the cost of change feels heavier than the cost of delay. The dollar's role entered a new phase. Its dominance wasn't destroyed. It was questioned. That distinction matters. In late-stage empires, currency doesn't fail first. It becomes contested. Alternatives emerge not because they are stronger, but because reliance feels uncomfortable. Trust doesn't vanish, it fragments in. The anchor still holds, but more hands grip the rope, testing how secure it really is. Technology accelerated through all of this, outpacing governance. New tools reshaped behavior before institutions could adapt. The gap between capability and control widened. Systems designed for a slower era struggled to regulate a faster one. The result wasn't dysfunction, it was lag. And lag, inside complex systems, quietly accumulates risk. This is the hidden mechanism of rebalancing pressure. Nothing breaks outright. Everything strains slightly. The system compensates by borrowing time, smoothing friction, deferring decisions. It still works, but it feels heavier, like a massive structure built for storms, now standing in constant wind, not collapsing, always adjusting. History offers context. Rome didn't disappear in 476, it fragmented, adapted, and re-emerged in different forms. Britain didn't vanish after 1945. It recalibrated, shrinking in reach while stabilizing in influence. Decline here doesn't mean disappearance. It means relative repositioning. So where is America in 2026? Late in stagnation. Entering rebalancing. The old model still runs, but it no longer delivers the same outcomes. The new model isn't visible yet. And that gap creates uncertainty. Not the explosive kind, but the heavy kind. The kind without a clear ending. This is the moment when empires stop expanding and start deciding who they will become next. Not through speeches, not through plans, but through choices made under sustained pressure. History suggests the outcome depends less on strength than on awareness. Because systems don't fail when they weaken. They fail when they misunderstand the phase they're in and mistake strain for permanence. So what does this actually mean? Here and now, it means the American empire has entered a phase where choices matter more than power. The era when growth could absorb every contradiction is over. The era when scale could postpone every trade-off has ended. What remains is a narrower window, not of collapse, but of adjustment. In the next 5 to 10 years, the defining question will not be whether the United States remains strong. It almost certainly will. The question will be what kind of strength it chooses to preserve, and what it quietly allows to fade. Because rebalancing is not a single decision. It is a series of constrained ones, made under pressure, with incomplete information. History shows what happens next is rarely dramatic at first. It looks like simplification, fewer commitments, harder priorities, slower growth accepted in exchange for stability, institutions forced to choose between reach and resilience, systems redesigned not to dominate everything, but to survive friction. This is why 2026 feels heavier than the years before it. Not because disaster is imminent, but because there is less room to pretend that the old model still works. Every policy now reveals a cost. Every delay compounds pressure. Every attempt to preserve everything makes the system more brittle. Empires that navigate this phase successfully do not do so by doubling down on expansion. They do so by recognizing limits early enough to shape them. They rebalance deliberately, rather than being rebalanced by events. Those that fail make a simpler mistake. They keep acting as if time is still on their side. The American empire is not at the end of its story, but it is at the end of a chapter that lasted longer, reached farther, and carried more weight than any before it. What comes next will not be decided by speeches or elections alone. It will be decided by whether the system understands the phase it is in and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Because history is unforgiving in one specific way. It does not punish weakness. It punishes misread timing, and the most dangerous moment in any empire's life is not when it falls, but when it still stands strong, while the window to change quietly begins to close.